All right. Hello again, Adventures, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is daily vlog number 149. And today, I have been inspired. I don't even know why. I know why. I watched a podcast where they were talking about the new Vecna book and stuff like that. And one of the people on there that I have no idea who they were because I completely missed when everybody introduced themselves and there were no nameplates. But I believe they have either worked with Wizard of the Coast or they have some experience in game design related to D&D because they were remarkably knowledgeable. But they mentioned the idea. They didn't say this specifically, but the kind of implication that they made was using Vecna was kind of lazy writing because they just kept stealing stuff from the original D&D campaign setting, which originally didn't have a name, but eventually became Earth. And so I started looking into Vecna a little bit and trying to find out, because I don't agree with that in any way, shape, or form, but that's another video that we're going to make sometime, maybe not. And I started looking into, I searched Vecna, and of course it brought up Stranger Things, and then I saw this weird theory. And this is just a theory, this is not a spoiler or anything, this is just people theorizing about stuff. Somebody floated the idea that the big bad of season 5 for Stranger Things was not going to be Vecna, but was going to be a character named Boris, spelled Borys. And the vast majority of D&D players, if you tell them the name Boris, they're going to go like Natasha? Boris and Natasha, trying to catch moose and squirrel. No, the character of Boris, Borys, is actually a character from the Dark Sun universe, and specifically they're known as Boris, in parentheses, the dragon, because they are the only dragon in the entirety of Athas, which is the world of the Dark Sun. And it made me do a deep dive back into Dark Sun. And for those of you that don't know, Dark Sun is my favorite D&D campaign setting. I think it is amazing. One of my favorite games ever is Dark Sun Shattered Lands, which is an old DOS game that I have played and replayed dozens of times. I believe I even have, for Daily December, I believe I made a bunch of characters in Dark Sun just for fun because I enjoy creating characters. So I wanted to talk specifically about Boris and the history of the planet Athas, because I really, really love it, and to kind of explain, hopefully show why I love the world of Athas so much, because it's such a different setting than any other D&D campaign setting that has ever existed. So today's video, we're going to talk about the history of Athas. So, the world of Dark Sun, as far as player characters are concerned, is set in one of the ages of the planet Athas. And the age that all the Dark Sun games and all the source books and everything are set in is commonly referred to as the Sorcerer King age. And that's because the people that have the most power and are basically running the world, or at least the tier area, are Sorcerer Kings, which are these kind of quasi, almost deity-like humans, actually. And there's a reason why we'll discuss this as we talk about history. So that's, and the world itself, the sun itself is red. That's why it's considered the dark sun, because the red sun is significantly darker than the yellow sun that was there previously, or even before that, the azure sun that existed during the Blue Age. And the world itself is a hellscape. It is a massive desert. Metal is extremely rare. So most weapons and armor are made of bone or obsidian, which is basically volcanic glass. And water is so rare that it's sometimes used as a currency. The other currency that is extremely common is bits of ceramic. A piece of ceramic is a ceramic coin. It's about this big, roughly, and it has perforations on it that allow you to break it up into 8 different bits. And that's what you use to trade, is ceramic coins and bits. So 8 bits makes a coin, and it's a really fascinating thing. But the world of Athas, as most players know it, is this God's forsaken wasteland where it is a struggle to simply survive, and it is incredibly corrupt. The Sorcerer Kings use fear and torture and enact slavery in order to keep people compliant. It is the worst of the worst of the worst winning, effectively. Athas is effectively what happens when the bad guys win. However, the history of the planet of Athas is so much more robust, and actually, I think, makes the setting that much more fascinating when you find out exactly how it became the burnt, disgusting place that it is, where there are no gods, and things like that. So let's talk about the true history of Athas. So the first age of Athas was referred to as the Blue Age for 2 reasons. One, the planet that is now almost completely a desert, at that point was mostly water. There were a few islands and things like that strewn about, and most of the dry land on Athas was either kind of swampy marshlands or little islands that were covered in like verdant forests. So one of the reasons this era is called the Blue Age is because the planet itself was blue. The other reason was the sun in the sky was also blue. They called it, the term they use is actually azure colored sun. But the actual sun itself was blue instead of the yellow sun that you see everywhere else and you see on planet Earth, which might indicate, if we want to go into astronomy, which might indicate that it was just an extremely young star. But anyway, in this world during the Blue Age, there was only one race that existed, and that's what they're called. And that race was an ancient version of halflings called the Rulisti. And the Rulisti were very kind of in touch with nature. They were very, very close with nature. And eventually a few of them started to learn about this particular material that they could kind of manipulate, that they found in the water. And as they studied it more and more, they realized that this particular material, they could change it to anything that they wanted, just using their form of magic. And as they studied it more and more, they started realizing that there were not that many differences between this material and literally everything else. And so by studying this and becoming more proficient with this magic, they learned how to basically modify life in general. And they actually had a name, Life Shapers. So these Life Shapers, which were the most powerful of these Rulisti, began to basically create like living boats, living houses, all that stuff. But they had some extremely strict rules in place. One of the most important was the idea that they were never allowed to take for granted the things that they were creating. They never treated them as objects or as tools or anything. These were living creatures that they had modified using their life-shaping magic to be useful to them. But they were still living creatures. They still required respect. And there were certain things that you simply couldn't do. You couldn't use it to, transform, sentient creatures into other things, or use it for your own personal gain. Like, they were this incredibly ethical, very honor-bound civilization. And all of their cities were floating. Because, again, most of the world was water. And it was actually this really thriving world. Until a lot of times when you hear about this kind of optimal utopian society, what happens is eventually the wrong kind of people get in power, and then the power corrupts, and then they do something horrible, and it ends up ruining the world. It's actually not what happens in Athas. While the Life Shapers were very, very powerful, and there was actually an offshoot of the Life Shapers that started meddling in some really, really bad stuff. They were eventually found out. They were punished. Those aren't the people that actually destroyed the world. It was actually the Life Shapers, and the reason that they destroyed the world was purely by altruistic accident. The Life Shapers, again, the only kind of sapient race were the Rulisti, which again was an ancient version of Halfling. They wanted to see, effectively, they wanted to see more biodiversity. And all life came from the oceans. Like, the oceans were the biggest thing, because, again, it covered most of the planet. Athas at that point was a mostly ocean world. And so they kept trying to come up with a way to make it possible for the ocean to just create more life. Because aside from the Rulisti, I think at one point there might have been like really, really early forms of the Thrycreen, which are an insectoid race. They weren't the Thrycreen that we see in modern Dark Sun. They were just kind of insects that were starting to evolve to a little bit more than what we currently know as insects. And so they had this idea that they're going to basically hyper-infuse the oceans to just be this kind of vast primordial ocean that would just start spewing out different kinds of life forms and make it very, very easy for life to just thrive on the planet. Again, the entire purpose of life shaping and things like that, the entire magic system that they used, was to encourage life and to create more life. Unfortunately, it didn't work. They released this horrible thing that was called the Brown Wave. Make all the jokes that you want. The reason it was called that is it actually turned the ocean brown where it started, and then it spread. And anything it touched, it instantly killed. So it was extremely deadly. And instead of inspiring new life and creating more biodiversity, it was going to go around the world and wipe out most of the life on the planet. Basically, if you couldn't get out of the ocean or away from it in some way, shape, or form, you were going to die. Now, a large portion of the Rulisti, seeing this incredibly dangerous planet-threatening plague spreading, and due to the fact that as far as they could tell there was nothing they could do to stop it, went into complete survival mode. They went, we screwed up, yeah, of course we did, but if we sit here and just die with everything else, then the planet turns into nothing. We're going to go hide. They went into subterranean caverns and they went and they hid away to try and preserve the last remnants of life. And hopefully, after this brown wave finished, they would be able to try to rebuild the planet. However, a few of them went, hey, screw that. We're not going to give up on this world just yet. And they created this giant tower that I can't remember what it was called. Rebirth. It was called the Brown Tides, not the Brown Wave, the Brown Tides, sorry. They built an instrument called the Pristine Tower. Really cool tower thing. If you have ever played Final Fantasy 14, the Crystal Tower, same basic principle. The Pristine Tower was basically designed to be a conduit to siphon some of the life-giving energy from the Azure Sun to basically stop the brown tide. And that's exactly what they did. They used the Pristine Tower, and they were able to wipe out the brown tide. However, by using so much of the sun's energy, the sun changed from azure to yellow. And the change of the color of the sun also meant a change to just the planetary ecology. The sun itself became a little bit hotter and actually started evaporating the massive ocean that covered the entire world. And as the ocean evaporated, new ground was found beneath it that was extremely fertile. And so large portions of the world of Athas that were underwater since the beginning of time, effectively, were now being revealed as dry land for the first time, and huge amounts of life just began to spring up. This particular part of Athesian history is called the Rebirth, which is basically, and funnily enough, again, the halflings, the Rustili or whatever they were called, Rulisti. The Rulisti were attempting to find a way to create more biodiversity and create more life. They created the brown tide, which almost wiped out all life on the planet. And then after fixing that, they created the Green Age and created a crap ton of new life. Now, some of the remaining Rulisti decided to thank you, phone. Some of the Rulisti decided to basically abandon the world and go hide off. I think I misspoke that they did that at the end of the Blue Age. They did that at the beginning of the Green Age, which came right after the Restoration, or what was it called? The Rebirth. There we go. And so they go and they find their places, and they actually, because they were so scarred from what happened with the Brown Tide, they revert to a more kind of tribal, ritualistic society and give up on magic completely. The few that stay, deciding instead of being kind of overlords of this new world, they start using their life-shaping magic to physically change themselves, and they create all the new races that show up, or most of the new races that show up in the Dark Sun campaign setting: humans, elves, dwarves, all those different things. And then they go out and they help to populate this new land. And again, life starts to thrive. A few things start changing. First, we start seeing the beginning of the elemental cults. As I mentioned before, unlike all other kind of D&D settings, there are no deities on Athas by the time we can make player characters there. And we'll talk about what happens to them as we go a little bit further in history. But divine magic in and of itself is not really a thing because it can't be blessed It can't be given to it can't be given to the acolytes by deities, which is kind of the definition of divine magic. So these elemental cults start forming, and they basically worship the elements and very, very powerful elemental beings as gods. And these very powerful elemental beings are able to grant spells like a deity would. And so in the Dark Sun campaign setting, clerics do not devote themselves to a don't devote themselves to don't devote themselves to a deity. They devote themselves to an elemental sphere. So you have the spheres of fire, water, earth, and air. And then there's another one that I can't remember what the last one, but it's kind of a universal sphere as well, where clerics in general in the Dark Sun campaign setting, their spell list is chosen by which elemental sphere they worship. And so you can only have fire spells and this kind of universal spell if you're a fire cleric, things like that. So elemental clerics are starting to exist at this point, but they're not the force that they eventually become. During this time, the various societies do start to kind of form and create their own gods. And they do develop temples and stuff like that. And there's a little bit of argument in the lore as far as whether these were true deities or whether they were just things that people made up, that they convinced were deities. One thing that is agreed upon about everybody, though, is that the deities themselves were never able to grant spells like deities in literally every other D&D campaign setting. One of the explanations for why none of those deities are worshipped anymore in modern Athas is, one, they never actually existed and they were just made up by people. Two, they did exist, but when they were starting to become powerful enough to be kind of true deities and actually kind of affect the world, the elemental beings that were granting the elemental clerics their power, they banded together and killed off all of the deities. And that's actually the version of history that I tend to prefer, because I just kind of enjoy the idea of, yeah, I mean, they did have deities at one point, but they're all dead now. I just find that, again, compared to your standard D&D campaign setting, that's a really, really kind of metal, crazy thing. It also kind of reminds me of, there's a line in Star Trek, DS9, where Kira is talking about the prophets and things like that, and Worf and how they're kind of hard to interpret and things like that. Worf just says something along the lines, your gods are confusing. And Kira goes, what? And Klingon gods aren't? He goes, Klingon gods are dead. They were killed by Klingon warriors because they proved to be too troublesome. And I just love I love that idea of Klingons were so badass that when the gods started messing with them, instead of going, curse you gods, how you manipulate us mortals, so they just went, oh, you're going to screw us? Batleth, brain. I just love that. And so I kind of love that idea of there were gods and they got their asses kicked by elementals, effectively, and primordial elementals. So anyway, the Green Age is flourishing. The world has never, even in the Blue Age, the world has never seen such a kind of growth and things. And in that age, a character is born named Rajat. Rajat is part of a group of people called the Pyrene, I believe is what they're called, who tend to be a very druidic society. Again, with the idea that all clerics are elemental clerics, druids in general in Athas are really, really powerful. Even at the kind of dead world of Athas that exists when players are in it, druids are still relatively powerful because they can use the power of the elements like the elemental clerics, but they also can just use the power of the little bit of nature that is still left on the planet. So this character of Rajat starts to discover arcane magic, which is basically the evolution of the life-shaping magic that the Rulisti, again, ancient halflings, used during the Blue Age. It's the same basic principle as arcane magic, very kind of science-based. And while he's learning the secrets of arcane magic, he also starts learning about the Blue Age and the kind of utopian society that existed there. And he came to the decision that the reason that the world itself was as chaotic as it is, because despite the fact that the Green Age had a lot of life and everything, there were so many different cultures and things like that there was a lot of conflict. And there was a bunch of different races that were all kind of vying for supremacy. And so he came to the decision that the Green Age that they were currently in was wrong, and the world itself should be returned to the Blue Age, with only the halflings existing to kind of rule over the world, basically trying to recreate the Blue Age. And so what he does is he develops a new kind of magic called preserving. Again, because arcane magic is basically an offshoot of that life-shaping magic that the Rulisti used. It involves the manipulation of kind of life itself. And so arcane magic on Athas in the Dark Sun world actually needs resources in the amount of life. It has to use life. So if you want to cast Fireball, you need to drain life from the surrounding area to create the Fireball in order to shoot it. Preserving magic is created in such a way that anytime that you take life away from an area, you find a way to give some of it back so it doesn't cause permanent damage. It still involves draining life to fuel your spells, but it is kind of carbon neutral, if we want to use a modern term for it. So Rajat starts teaching preserving magic to some people, but he limits the people that he teaches it to. Specifically, he teaches it exclusively to humans. And the reason he gives everyone else why he won't teach it to elves or dwarves or any of the other races is that humans have the most potential, and they're the only ones that can really handle the just vast amount of power that is contained within preserving magic. The actual reason we'll get to in a little bit, but it's not that. That's a complete lie. So he starts teaching preserving magic to humans by the thousands. And he lives for over 1,000 years teaching these humans preserving magic. However, quite a few of the humans that learn it start going, yeah, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. I've got a bunch of elven friends. They seem pretty smart. I don't understand why they wouldn't be able to do this. And so they start slowly trying to teach the other races how to do preserving magic. And by the way, a practitioner of preserving magic is called a preserver. So the secrets of preserving magic is starting to slowly bleed out of an exclusively human thing, and Rajat gets pissed. He gets absolutely, completely infuriated and actually commands his followers to kill off any of the non-human people that have learned preserving magic as a way to preserve it. and people start to realize that maybe Rajat isn't as nice a guy as they thought. So, the secret history. What Rajat has really been doing, again, he's decided that the world would be a lot better if halflings ruled it. And again, he's not a halfling. He's never been a halfling. He's this race called the Pyrene or something similar to that. He was Pyrex. He just decided that the world was better in the Blue Age, and because halflings were the only race that existed during the Blue Age, then they're the only race that should exist. So, while he was teaching all these people preserving magic, he found a select few humans, and he started teaching them defiling magic. Now, defiling magic is basically kind of the same as preserving magic. It's arcane magic. But again, on Athas, in order to cast arcane spells, you need to gather power from the life that is around you. Preserving magic does everything it can to be, again, carbon neutral. Defiling magic doesn't. A really good example of defiling magic is a defiler would kind of create a fireball, cast it, and you would be able to see the kind of explosion pattern of where the fireball hit by scorch marks and stuff like that. But if you would look at the battlefield after the defiler left, you would see a ring around where the defiler was of just everything being dead, because it drew all of the life out of the soil, out of the plants, out of everything near it, and cast it, and used that to create the fireballs. Because preserving magic was designed to be kind of carbon neutral, they were always kind of holding back on their spell casting and things like that to ensure that they could put the magic back into the land so it wouldn't permanently damage it. Defiling magic had no such qualms, and because of that, it was technically more powerful. They could draw more energy than preservers could. The problem with it was, again, it led to permanent damage to the world. So long-term use of defiling magic would eventually kind of scorch everything. And you can start to see the building blocks of where Athas comes from. Rajat eventually picks 13 of these defilers that he's chosen, and he turns them into his champions. He uses a device known as the Dark Lens, and he actually starts changing them. They become these pseudo-immortal, almost deity-like creatures. They're pseudo-deities. And then each one, he gives the job of exterminating one of the races. We don't know all of the 13 champions, but we know of a few of them, and the ones, and each one of them is named after the race that they were supposed to kill. Some of them succeeded, most of them didn't. The 13th champion was a person known as Boris. Remember the dragon we were talking about before? This is Boris. So Boris was given the job of exterminating the dwarves. And he was actually doing a relatively good job at it when he suddenly just stopped and ran away. He was fighting against the dwarven king Rakad. And in the middle of the battle, he just kind of ran away eventually. He does eventually come back to continue fighting him, and Rajat actually gave him a magic sword. It's one of the few magic swords that still exist in Dark Sun. And he actually uses it to kill Rakad. And so the sword itself eventually gets called the Scourge of Rakad. And he actually, Boris actually loses the sword during that fight, and it doesn't show up until centuries later during the Age of Sorcerer Kings. So, one of the reasons that Boris kind of ditched his conquest of the dwarves for a little bit is he started realizing Rajat is not a good guy. And when he's done having his champions go out and exterminate all the races, Rajat has told them, yeah, we're going to recreate the Blue Age, and it's going to be this utopian paradise. Rajat kind of left out the fact that only halflings are going to exist, and that includes all of the champions. Once the champions are done, Rajat is going to use their near immortal life force to recreate the Azure Sun. He's going to kill them all. Boris realizes this, goes, this might turn out bad for me. And so he leads a rebellion with a few of the other champions. And he comes up with this idea of, if they're going to take out Rajat, they can't kill him. Rajat is so powerful that killing him is just not something that's going to happen. So they come up with this idea of, hey, we could trap him. We could trap him in what's called the Hollow. In Dark Sun, there are effectively only three kind of planes. You have the dark something, I can't remember what it's called. Basically, plane of darkness, which is technically, or it's called the dark, that's what it's called. And it's a plane of shadows. And even in the Age of Sorcerer Kings, the dark is actually remarkably easy to come in contact with. Quite a few spellcasters will actually create portals and things to the dark in order to basically, kind of in the same vein as a warlock patron, gain some power of the dark for themselves and give over a portion of themselves in order for it, and they become shadows. Fun fact about the dark, there are no portals to the dark in areas that have no light, because shadows can't exist without light. The other plane of existence is called the gray, and I don't know anywhere near as much about that one. But inside the dark, there's a kind of subsection called the Hollow, which is just pure blackness and nothingness. And that's where Boris thinks it would be the best to trap and contain Rajat. So, as he is, again, the champions themselves are near immortal. They're extremely powerful. They're nothing compared to Rajat. Rajat is so far beyond their capabilities that Boris comes up with this plan. See, there is a forbidden magic in defiling called, I can't remember what it's called, something involving the dragon. And basically what it is extremely powerful defilers can enact a ritual that over the course of years will eventually turn them into a dragon. However, the magic is so advanced, no one has ever succeeded in it. Because not only do you have to have complete mastery over defiling magic, you also have to have complete mastery over psionics. And this is another thing that showed up during the Green Age. During the Green Age, psionic magic, which is called the Way, blossomed. Everybody in the world had at least mild psionic capabilities. And as people became more aware of it, they started mastering it and things like that. And people who primarily used psionic magics were called psionicists. And so in order to become a dragon, you had to be a master defiler and a master psionicist. And from a mechanical standpoint, what that meant is you had to be a level 20 defiler plus a level 20 psionicist, which, due to how rules worked in 2nd edition, there was actually caps to levels you could get for different races and things like that. Humans were the only ones that could basically dual class into both defiler and psionicist and get both to level 20. So because of that, becoming a dragon and casting this high-level defiling spell was only possible for humans, which again, all the champions of Rajat, despite their kind of immortal status, were still technically human. So that's what Boris decides to do. He convinces the other champions that are still alive to help him cast this spell. Well, the thing about this spell is it's a high-level defiling magic. And as you get higher and higher defiling magic, you can't just draw life out of the ground. There's not enough life force in the ground close enough to you to be able to cast your spells. So high-level defiling magic uses sacrifice of actual living beings. And in order to cast the spell for draconic transformation, you need to have 1,000 people sacrificed. And basically, the way that the way the spell is written is the 1,000 people have to be sacrificed one heartbeat after the defiling magic ritual that turns the defiler into a dragon is cast. So it's immediate, has to happen. So they start rounding up a bunch of people to be used for sacrifice. Well, that's not the only step of becoming a dragon. Again, the dragon is a metamorphosis, and it is an unbelievably painful, horrible transformation that takes years. And so during the time that this transformation is taking place, the dragon effectively has to wander around the land, destroying all life it comes across as a way to kind of satiate the immense amount of pain and magic that's being infused into its body. So Boris goes on a rampage, killing tons and tons and tons and tons of people. Eventually, he does finally finish his dragon transformation, becomes the only dragon in the entirety of the planet of Athas. And because he is so powerful, he is able to use the Dark Lens, the same thing that was used to transform him and the other champions into these nigh immortal beings. And he uses the Dark Lens to trap Rajat in the void, or in the hollow. So Rajat has been trapped. However, the way that he, I should slightly go backwards. When Rajat was creating the champions, he used the Dark Lens, but he used the Dark Lens and the Pristine Tower. You know, the thing that they used to drain the Azure Sun and stop the Brown Tide? He used the Pristine Tower and the Dark Lens to create his champions. Well, it siphoned some of the energy of the sun to do that, and the sun went from yellow to red, becoming the dark sun, because the red sun was significantly darker than the yellow sun that had been before it. And again, it caused widespread damage. Combine that with the immense amount of damage that Boris caused as he was transforming into a dragon, and you now have this post-apocalyptic desert land where gods don't exist. Arcane magic in and of itself is highly frowned upon, because despite the fact that preserving magic was taught first, most people see any sort of arcane magic and immediately assume that you're a defiler, which is real bad. Defilers wiped out the world as far as the vast population of the world is concerned. Druids are so hurt by the massive amount of life force that was drained from the world that they go and become hermits. And the world is ruled by what are called sorcerer kings. These are defilers that have become so powerful that they can actually grant spells very similar to how a deity would. So a lot of them just kind of assume the mantle of deity, and that's why they're called sorcerer kings. And now you have two different flavors of clerics. You have elemental clerics, who get their spells bestowed upon them by primordial elemental spirits, and you have Templars, who are clerics that serve the sorcerer kings and get their magic directly from the sorcerer kings. A lot of the sorcerer kings are former champions. And that's one of the reasons they were able to become as powerful as they were, because they were some of the first defilers, and they're nearly immortal because of what the Dark Lens did to them. Now, Boris has trapped Rajat in the Hollow. However, again, Rajat is extremely powerful and extremely smart. He came up with a plan to kind of kill the world and revert it to an earlier state. He's incredibly powerful. So in order to keep him trapped, Boris demands a sacrifice of 1,000 slaves a year from every single sorcerer king. So they create a slavery system, and again, they send off 1,000 people a year to Boris to kind of fuel this. But in the meantime, they have to run their own cities and things like that. And so they to keep the people placated. One of the things that becomes extremely popular in a lot of different places around Athas is gladiatorial combat. And that starts to become a really, really big thing. So that is where the character of Boris the dragon comes from. As far as do I think that's going to be what the big baddie of Stranger Things is going to be, I sincerely doubt it. Again, Dark Sun is a really, really niche D&D campaign setting that not a whole lot of people know about. The guy that originally created it has already said that he has no plans of bringing it to 5th edition because it just really wouldn't fit with the kind of philosophy of 5th edition, and it is a very problematic setting. Good example. Remember those halflings that after the Blue Age went and kind of reverted to a more tribalistic society because they were so kind of burnt from what happened with life-shaping shaping magic. Those halflings eventually evolve into the halflings that you see in modern Dark Sun, which are a cannibalistic, completely primal group of people that have a lot of similarities to tropes around pygmies, the idea of being cannibals and being savages and things like that, which have all proven to be a complete malarkey and extremely offensive stereotypes. That's effectively one of the kind of inspirations of the halflings themselves. Now, again, when you look at the entire history, it's significantly more complicated than that. You're basically looking at a race that has basically racial PTSD from what their ancestors did. But it's easy enough for activists now to make connections that are there and blow up. So, and there's a lot more of just stuff because the entire purpose of Dark Sun was to be the anti-D&D. They didn't want it to be like Forgotten Realms or Mystara or Earth or Blackmoor or any of those things like that. They wanted it to be completely weird and to the point where at one point they weren't going to have elves or dwarves either, but they got some pushback from TSR, which forced them to kind of include them, but their versions of elves and dwarves are very, very, very different. Elves are not the kind of noble magic using society. They're nomadic and extremely xenophobic. Dwarves are bald. So the idea of Boris in most D&D campaign settings, most of the people of Athas don't even know he exists. They have actively suppressed the knowledge of this dragon existing for a number of reasons. But one of the most important is it would prove that the Sorcerer Kings weren't gods, and they don't want that. So they send off their sacrifices without anyone being the wiser, because the only people that have ever seen Boris die instantly, as Boris kind of used his defiling magic to just suck all the life out of them and put it directly into the seal that's containing Rajat. Now, there is a novel series I think it's called The Prism Pentad, because it's 5 books, where a group of gladiators get together, and spoiler alert, part of the plot of this 5-book series is they eventually go up and attack and kill Boris and have to deal with what happens when Boris is no longer there. I have not read any of the books, but I would like to because they look really, really good. But I've read summaries and things like that. So depending on who you ask, Boris is basically Schrodinger's cat. He is both alive and dead depending on which part of the cosmology you are in. But he is the only dragon that has ever existed on Athas. There's been one other defiler that got close, called Dregoth, I think his name was. But the other Sorcerer Kings saw that he was getting close and murdered him. Because they're like, no way are we having another dragon. It was bad enough when we made Boris. We don't want another one of those assholes hanging around. And he actually became a really powerful kind of Dracolich style thing. Not as powerful as Boris, because he didn't complete the transformation, but still a really powerful lich undead creature that eventually learns to travel the multiverse and picks up a bunch of skills. And while he's away, Boris gets killed and he comes back and goes, hey, there's a power vacuum here, and I think I know who needs to fulfill it. So that is the very, very broad history of the world of Athas. It started off as this utopian society that, in their attempt to create more life, ended up nearly destroying the world. And then their kind of history and legend inspired a genocidal maniac to attempt to revert the world to an earlier state, and that created defiling magic and eventually turned Athas into the broken, burnt world that it is when adventurers are going through it. So, as you can see, really crazy, bizarre history that creates a very unique, interesting world to exist in. I mean, you can always compare things to like Mad Max and that when you're talking about post-apocalypse, where it's like, oh, well, everyone is turned into kind of a feudal society where everyone's just kind of vie for resources. But when you look at the world of Athas and the kind of juxtaposition of the world outside of the city-states, is death, not just because it is a desert, but because the the wildlife that has been able to survive in it is horrible, is extremely dangerous. Look up a Ravager from Dark Sun. They are terrifying creatures that just roam. They just roam the dunes or the Silt Sea and stuff like that. Like, the entire world is just a death trap trying to kill you, and the few places that are habitable are run by these incredibly corrupt, life-stealing, almost vampires, whose entire purpose is to rule with an iron fist so that they can give 1,000 people away to keep the true most evil creature in existence trapped by another extremely evil, horrible being. So yeah, it is a bonkers, crazy, dystopian, oppressive campaign that simply surviving in that world is extremely difficult. And if you can, live long enough to go to bed and wake up the next morning, that's a huge accomplishment. I don't know why, other than the fact that, again, I really love the Dark Sun computer game. That might be why I have such a fondness for the setting as a whole. But I find the setting to be absolutely fascinating. I think it is one of the most brilliant settings that have ever existed, simply because it didn't just kind of like rebel against tropes. It actively did everything it could to ensure that there were none of the common fantasy tropes in there. And again, some of the things they took a little bit too far. I will admit that. But yeah, I think it's an incredibly, and again, coming from someone that has lived a life where I've had to deal with some pretty bad stuff, not just from my own history, but as soon as I started dealing with disability, being disabled in this world is a terrifying experience. It really, really is. And we're constantly seeing more and more things happening where I don't want to go into this video, but it's scary to be disabled right now. Let's just put it that way. It's really scary. Um, so yeah, like I said, it's a fascinating, really unique history to an extremely fascinating world. And again, playing in a Dark Sun campaign setting is just brutal, but it is a lot of fun because if in a Dark Sun campaign setting, I think it's one of the reasons why kind of grimdark and stuff like that exists. Um, if you win, you are winning against some of the most evil things that have existed in history. You know, slavery, xenophobia, and racism. All of that stuff is not only present in Dark Sun, it is the norm. The people in power happily encourage all of it. And so you have the worst, most disgusting people in history winning. And then when your character comes in, you get to fight off against an entire campaign setting that is designed to kill you. And if you can succeed, it's just extremely fulfilling that you've been able, despite the fact that the deck is stacked so heavily against you, you have been able to succeed. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love Athas so much, because I identify heavily with the idea of the deck being stacked heavily against me and being able to kind of eke out an existence despite it. So, yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about the history of Athas because again, it's a campaign setting. It's never going to see the light of day in fifth edition. Like it's just not going to be a thing in fifth edition. I'll guarantee it. Even 5.5 that you're creating now, they're not going to bring back Dark Sun. But it lives on in homebrew and other stuff like that. And like I said, it's one of my favorite settings ever. To the point that I would love to run a Dark Sun campaign sometime. Maybe that's what I'll do for my Daily December campaign. I probably wouldn't run it in D&D 5.5 unless I'm really, really thrilled with 5.5. But I might use the setting and adapt another system, maybe like Savage Worlds, or I've heard some really good things about Genesis as well. Maybe use one of those systems to make that, but who knows. Anyway, it's going to be all for me today. I will see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.